No.
Well, I think it's really important the point you raise about the max out the credit card because it's pathetic. I tell you what, though, the TUC did some polling, and they had some really reputable people over from the States who did polling for Barack Obama. And one of the things the poll showed was that people did buy into the argument that the credit card had been maxed out. Now, my view of this is you've just got to take that full on, and you've got to show why the idea that one of the most advanced capitalist countries in the world is akin to a household budget, and that everything's got to be within your weekly shop. It just treats people as stupid. The trouble is when it's pumped out continuously by the mass media, people do start saying, "Well, where does the money come from?" And in a way, there's no shortcut to really just looking at that, some basic economics, and just having an argument about it. Now, I think there are ways you can begin to get it across. My kids were asking me to explain to them what was going on in Greece in terms of the international markets and how the markets could demand what they were demanding. And I took a brave stab. I mean, I've now been a teacher, and I left school with hardly any O levels and all the rest of it. But the way that I explained it to them that they made sense of was by doing an analogy between the markets are very similar to loan sharks and payday loan companies in this sense, because they knew what they were. And it's on the sense that what a loan shark does is it encourages people to borrow money. The poorer you are, the bigger the interest rate that they charge, the less able you are to be able to pay back. You get in more and more and more of a mess. And then what happens is the bailiffs come and barge their way in and they take all your possessions. Now, the analogy to Greece is that Greece borrowed and borrowed and borrowed at ridiculous rates on the international markets because they're seen as vulnerable, and they don't get the bailiffs. What they get now is people telling them you've got to sell off all your state assets. The one that did it for me was they got to sell their islands. Because actually what that did was it got across a point of who's preying on who's exploiting who's the victim, and how is it justified and how is it opposed. Now that did for my son, but he is only 14. It was easier than explaining the offside trap in football, but anyway. So I think we've got to find ways at confronting it. The pamphlets we've talked about actually do show that in the post-war years, if we took the argument that is currently being taken now, we wouldn't have built council houses and schools and the welfare state and everything else. We couldn't afford it. We presumably still have rationing. So I think it is about saying the way to put the economy right is to invest, to grow, to get more people at work, doing things that are useful and productive, and then they generate in amongst themselves money. And there are opportunities to popularise that argument. Let me just give you this example. Regional pay. The government wants regional pay or market-facing pay, and its argument is that the market should drive pay rates down. And if you take a simple example of Swansea as a city, Swansea in Wales is disproportionately dependent on public sector employment. In Swansea in particular as a city is massively dependent on public sector employment. The NHS, the government, the education service and the DVLA alone employs over 3,000 people in Swansea. Now, the idea, it's very easy to get across the argument in the Swansea Evening Post and a public meeting in Swansea that if you depress the pay of all those public sector workers, they have less money to spend in the economy of Swansea, and therefore local businesses and people who are in shops and pubs and clubs, less money to spend, they go to the wall. And therefore people understand, I think, you need more money in Swansea, and you don't get that by forcing everything down. And again, it's a small way. But I think some of the slogans that we've used is it's got to be better to be in work paying tax and national insurance than out of work claiming welfare is a fairly straightforward way of making an argument. But I think we've also got to do the hard yards with the serious economic stuff and take that into the heart of Parliament and politicians and into the the debate, because we can't let them get away with telling us that we're all the patronising stuff. I mean, Ruth Lee. Does everybody know Ruth Lee? Mm-hmm. I went on the radio and did a debate with Ruth Lee. It was about 2 years ago, and it was all kicking off. And I was trying to make the point that where's been the public debate about what the markets are doing. And people aren't having any say whatsoever. It's been done to us by the markets. And she said to me, "It's on the radio. she said, just because you haven't had your debate in the Pig and Whistle, don't confuse that with the fact that leading economists are having this debate in markets around the world. I thought, well, ka-ching. Because what she's really saying is, you're all plebs. You don't understand. You leave it to us, and we'll sort it out, and we get very rich while we're at it. And so, so I think you need a mixture of making struggles relevant, drawing out the economics of that, some popularized slogans, and also the serious stuff where we challenge them. In terms of the point about Birmingham against the cuts, my own view, we've tried hard to get people involved in local anti-cuts groups, and I think with some success. I think the strength of the local anti-cuts movement and the bodies that we need is probably to recognise, and not everybody likes this, but my own view is you have to oppose all cuts in order to make those things that are realistically going to grow. Now, I say that because if you don't oppose all cuts, and let's be clear, when people try to take the mickey and say, do you not want cuts in nuclear weapons? I'll say, yes, I'm happy to have cuts in nuclear weapons. But what we know by cuts is cuts in services and public spending. If you don't oppose it all as actually making the situation worse and therefore it's counterproductive, and so the last thing you want is cuts, that's not the solution, then it's very difficult to unite a lot of people because you start picking and choosing. You start getting into, well, all right, perhaps we don't need a swimming pool, we've got one there, I'd rather have a library. Or perhaps we don't need resources into home care and home helps, perhaps something else is more important. And once you do that, everybody becomes just looking at their own bit. We're all doomed inevitably. It's very, very rare that those will generate enough support to win. And bit by bit, like dominoes, we all go down. So I think you start by saying we get everybody involved because actually whether it's the job centre or the school or the library, or the leisure facilities, if we all supported what we're fighting against in the Youre now, any victories actually like a snowball going downhill, it'll gather, confidence will grow. And I think that to me is one of the important keys to unlock the argument. I think it also takes on the point of the first question raised, which is I go out of my way whenever I get a chance to do a media interview. I've done it quite a few times on Radio 4 and on Newsnight, to actually just throw in right at the beginning, there shouldn't be any cuts at all. And what you find is it's incredible when you say that. They say, what? No cuts at all? What do you mean no cuts? And it actually tries to start the debate where we want to start it. Because the minute you start it, well, we have to know there's some cuts, you're on a slippery slope. It's the trouble with Labour, is that, when I was on Question Time with Boris Johnson and Diane Abbott, Boris Johnson was ruthless, right? And he made Diane Abbott look daft because he essentially said, well, the thing is, Diane, what you're saying is our cuts are nasty and your cuts are kind. And the whole audience who's in East London were with him on the point he was making, because what they knew is they didn't want cuts, never mind whose they were. And I think, therefore, that if you don't define yourself in that way, you can lose a lot of your legitimacy. And even now, I think, although I think there's signs that, some Labour politicians are a bit more competitive, they fall not only to this is the mess you left us in, but the other one they keep saying is Alistair Darling's spending plans were actually cuts. They weren't quite as bad, but they weren't far off. And that's true. If Labour had won the election and implemented Alistair Darling's economic plan, we would have had a strike on pensions, we would be resisting welfare cuts, and we would be fighting massive redundancies, because it was Labour's programme, it just wasn't as bad, wasn't as fast. So I think that is about defining, where you start from, and then out of that you can popularise stuff. On the point raised by a colleague here, I think they're very valid points, and they're ones that I've no doubt we don't get right. Give credit to the RMT. The RMT have raised this question of Mode 4, and they were the ones in the TUC who were trying to raise what some of the dangers of it were. I think sometimes we don't get across the big picture and join the dots. And a lot of these things, I think, as you pointed out, are very interconnected, actually, and the one opens up a door to actually lead to the other. I think what that means for me is that our strategy has to be based on resisting now the effects, but in the explanation as to why we should resist, try to raise the bar that people understand where a lot of these things come from and where else it leads. And I think the question about offshoring and globalization and stuff, the issue of cheap labour and people not getting the terms and conditions here that often comes up, sometimes raises the uncomfortable question, that some people have been worried about, which is ending up with slogans like British jobs for British workers. Because at the end of the day, I don't think that is our movement's slogan. On the other hand, we're not too afraid to say it's clearly absurd if we are shutting down all sorts of functions here and allowing them to be done somewhere else on poverty wages that undercut us, by 80 or 90%. And I'm not sure we always get that absolutely quite right, because I think the answer has to be that actually we want to level up, that actually we're not in favour, of poverty existing in other parts of the world. We want people to level up. But in having these broader ideals, that doesn't mean that you can't defend what we've got in the here and now. But I think you have to do it by making the right arguments. And I don't think we've ever really bottomed that discussion out, to be honest. And I think it is something that we should do. And I think, again, give credit. And I just want to finish on this with the RMT. It comes back to the European point. The one thing you can say about Bob Crow and the RMT is I think they very, very brilliantly, actually, articulate some of the real issues that some people are afraid to say, and they put them in the context of defending things in the here and now. And Bob puts them differently to other people, but he makes points that most people often are not prepared to make. And I think that does us a service. And it is right, although I may start from a slightly different position on Europe to Bob, it is down to the stuff that the RMP has done, that people have talked about, some of the things that have gone through the European Union that has challenged democracy, put the hands of decisions into unelected, commissioners and bankers. And it's been a service to us that he's done it. And I think they've started that on Mode 4. And so I just want to think that, to me, that's an example. People can be quite snobby about the RMT. I tell you, even within our own movement, you get criticism of the fact that they think the RMT are a bit too combative. And my own view is actually the reason why the RMT, I think, is respected among so many activists and members is they say what it does on the tin. And when their members want to fight, they get behind them each and every time. And they don't find excuses not to do it. They actually do it. And I think that's why, as a union, they're one of the most important and significant contributors to taking the way forward, and long may it continue.
And a growing union.
And a growing union. Yeah.
And they have a very good summer party.
But you both of you, and indeed the audience, have identified a whole number of points that need to be conveyed to the population. But I spent a lot of time recently representing the NUJ and the Leveson inquiry, where the full, not the full, but an extent of the depravity of the mass media has been revealed. But people are still not making the connection. Ordinary people are still not making the connection between this utterly corrupt, ruthless PR machine that is the mass media, and the fact that what the message they're conveying is a bunch of lies, and it's a fundamental problem for the trade unions and those on the left to get their message across in the face of this wall of media propaganda, which we hear even in the BBC has moved to the right on all these issues as well. I just wonder what the answer to that is. I mean, one thing that obviously occurs to me is that the fact, in spite of the fact that union membership has decreased over the last 30 years, we still have 6.5 million members. That's 1 in every 10 human beings that live in the United Kingdom, men, women and children, old age pensioners, employed, unemployed, on the dole, whatever they do, 1 in 10, more than 1 in 10, is still a member of a trade union. And you guys have got a connection to those people and their families, which I wonder whether we're using as much as we should be using, or could be using.